The rain hammered against the cracked window of apartment 3B as 7-year-old Trevor Mitchell pressed his face against the cold glass, watching the sleek black car pull up to the curb below. It was the third Tuesday of the month, which meant the man in the expensive suit would arrive at exactly 6:30 in the evening, just as he had for as long as Trevor could remember. The boy's mother, Caroline Mitchell, always became nervous on these days, smoothing her worn apron repeatedly and checking her reflection in the small mirror by the door, tucking stray auburn curls behind her ears with trembling fingers. Trevor had learned to recognize the pattern years ago, back when he was barely tall enough to reach the window ledge. The man never came upstairs. He never knocked on their door. Instead, he would sit in his car for exactly 7 minutes, and during those 7 minutes, Caroline would hurry downstairs with a small envelope, exchange a few words Trevor could never quite hear, and return with her eyes slightly red and her hands clutching a different, thicker envelope. She never talked about these encounters, and Trevor had learned not to ask, storing his questions in the growing collection of mysteries that surrounded his young life. The apartment building stood in the forgotten corner of Portland's industrial district, where rust stained the fire escapes and the streetlights flickered more often than they glowed. Their third-floor unit consisted of 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen with appliances that predated Trevor's birth, and a living room that doubled as his play area. The floral wallpaper, faded and peeling at the corners, had witnessed countless dinners of pasta and canned vegetables, homework sessions at the wobbly kitchen table, and nights when Caroline thought her son was asleep, but he could hear her quiet sobs through the thin walls. "Trevor, honey, please step away from the window," Caroline called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular tension it only held on third Tuesdays. She was preparing dinner, the same chicken casserole she always made on these evenings, as if the familiar routine could somehow normalize the strange ritual that defined these days. "Who is he, Mom?" Trevor asked, not for the first time, though he already knew what answer he would receive. His large hazel eyes, so different from his mother's blue ones, reflected the streetlight below as he turned to face her. Caroline set down the wooden spoon, her shoulders sagging slightly. She was only 32, but the years of working double shifts at the diner downtown had carved lines around her eyes and streaked her hair with premature gray. "Just someone who helps us out sometimes, sweetheart. Now please, wash your hands for dinner." But Trevor had grown older, more observant, more curious. He had noticed how their rent was always paid despite his mother's modest income. He had noticed how, whenever something broke in their apartment, it was mysteriously fixed within days. He had noticed the way his mother looked at that black car with an expression he couldn't quite name, part gratitude, part sadness, part something else entirely that made her look younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. The man in the car was different from anyone else in their neighborhood. While Trevor's classmates' fathers wore flannel shirts and worked with their hands, this man wore suits that probably cost more than their monthly rent. His car was always immaculate, even in Portland's rainy season, and there was something about the way he sat in that driver's seat, staring up at their building with an intensity that Trevor could feel even from 3 floors up, that suggested he wasn't just a charitable stranger or a social worker doing his rounds. Caroline descended the stairs with her envelope as she always did. But this time Trevor didn't stay at the window. Instead, he crept to the apartment door, opened it just a crack, and tiptoed to the top of the stairwell. From here, he could hear fragments of their conversation, floating up through the building's echoing interior. "Can't keep doing this, Nathan," his mother's voice, strained and emotional. "Caroline, please, we've been through this." The man's voice was deep, educated, carrying an authority that spoke of boardrooms and business decisions, yet softened by something that sounded almost like pleading. "He's getting older." He asked questions. "How much longer can I—" Caroline's voice broke, and Trevor heard what sounded like a sob being suppressed. "I know. God, I know. But my situation, the company, my father's expectations." The man's voice grew quieter, and Trevor had to strain to hear. "I think about you both every single day. You have to believe that." There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of rain hitting the building's overhang. Then his mother's voice came again, steadier now but laden with years of accumulated pain. "He has your eyes, Nathan. Exactly your eyes. Every time I look at him I see you. How long before he sees it too?" Trevor's heart hammered in his chest. The stairwell seemed to spin around him as the pieces of a puzzle he'd been unconsciously assembling for years suddenly clicked into place. The mysterious benefactor wasn't a social worker or a distant relative or a kind stranger. The man in the expensive suit was his father. But if he was Trevor's father, why did he only come once a month? Why did he sit in his car instead of coming upstairs? Why did Trevor's birth certificate list father unknown in the space where other kids had their dad's names written? And most confusing of all, why did his mother seem both desperate for these visits and devastated by them in equal measure? Caroline returned upstairs minutes later, her eyes dry but puffy, the thick envelope tucked into her cardigan pocket. She found Trevor exactly where she'd left him, sitting at the kitchen table with his math homework spread before him, though he hadn't written a single number since she'd gone downstairs. "All done with number 5? She asked with forced cheerfulness, kissing the top of his head as she passed. Trevor nodded, not trusting his voice, but his mind was racing with questions he suddenly wasn't sure he wanted answered. Who was Nathan? What company did he run? Why couldn't he be Trevor's father in the open instead of in secret? And what kind of situation and father's expectations could be powerful enough to keep a man away from his own son? That night, long after Caroline had tucked him in and retreated to her own room, Trevor lay awake listening to the sounds of the city beyond their window. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the stuttering streetlights. He thought about his classmates' fathers, who came to school plays and soccer games, who ruffled their kids' hair in the grocery store, who existed in broad daylight instead of hiding in expensive cars once a month. He thought about the envelope exchanges, now taking on an entirely different meaning. That wasn't charity. That was child support, delivered in shame and secrecy. His mother wasn't a grateful recipient of kindness from a stranger. She was a woman trapped in an impossible situation, accepting money from a man who had given her a child, but couldn't give her a life together. As sleep finally began to claim him, Trevor made a decision. He would wait until the next third Tuesday, but this time, he wouldn't stay upstairs. This time, he would go down to that black car, and he would ask the question that now burned in his chest with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He would look into those eyes his mother said matched his own, and he would ask the question that would change everything. He would ask the man in the expensive suit if he was his father. The month that followed stretched endlessly for Trevor, each day crawling by with agonizing slowness as he waited for the next third Tuesday to arrive. He became obsessed with small details he'd previously overlooked, studying his own reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning, searching for features that might belong to the mysterious man in the car. His eyes were hazel with distinctive gold flecks near the pupils, unusual enough that teachers had commented on them since kindergarten. His hair was darker than his mother's, almost black, with a slight wave that refused to be tamed no matter how much Caroline tried to smooth it down before school. At Roosevelt Elementary, Trevor found himself watching his classmates' interactions with their fathers with newfound intensity. He observed how Marcus Chen's dad picked him up every day at 3:15, how Sophia Rodriguez's father volunteered at the school library every Thursday, how Timothy Walsh's dad coached the weekend soccer team and brought orange slices for all the players. These fathers existed loudly, proudly, their presence woven into the fabric of their children's daily lives, in a way Trevor was beginning to understand he'd never experienced. Caroline noticed the change in her son but misinterpreted its source. She assumed he was simply entering that difficult age when children began to ask harder questions about absent parents, when the simple explanations that satisfied a 5-year-old no longer sufficed for a 7-year-old's expanding understanding of the world. She tried to compensate by being more present, more attentive, taking him to the free Saturday concerts in the park, and making his favorite meals more frequently. But Trevor could see the exhaustion in her movements, the way she sometimes leaned against the kitchen counter with her eyes closed, gathering strength for the next task, the next shift, the next day of holding their fragile life together. He wanted to tell her what he'd overheard, wanted to ask her directly about Nathan and the truth about his father, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the way she still flinched slightly on third Tuesdays, or the way she sometimes touched the small silver locket she wore around her neck, a locket Trevor had never seen her open. There was a fragility to his mother that he'd become acutely aware of, a sense that she was holding herself together through sheer will, and he feared that his questions might shatter whatever careful equilibrium she'd constructed. Instead, he began his own investigation. The school library became his refuge during lunch periods, where he would pull out newspapers and magazines, scanning them for any mention of a Nathan who ran a company important enough to have expectations and situations that kept him from his son. Portland had its share of successful businessmen, but Trevor was looking for something specific, though he couldn't quite articulate what. It was Mrs. Patterson, the school librarian, who unwittingly provided the breakthrough. "Interested in business, Trevor?" she asked one afternoon, finding him surrounded by copies of the Portland Business Journal. "That's unusual for someone your age." "I'm looking for someone," Trevor admitted, then quickly added, "for a school project." Mrs. Patterson smiled indulgently. "Well, if you're interested in Portland business leaders, you should check out the feature they did last month on the city's youngest CEOs. There were some fascinating profiles." She retrieved a glossy magazine from her desk, flipping to a dog-eared page. "This one particularly interested me. Nathan Prescott, 34 years old, CEO of Prescott Industries. Took over from his father 5 years ago and completely transformed the company. They manufacture medical equipment, I believe. Very impressive for someone so young." Trevor's hands trembled as he took the magazine. The photograph showed a man in his mid-30s with dark hair and striking hazel eyes flecked with gold. He stood in front of a modern glass building, arms crossed, expression serious, yet approachable. The resemblance was undeniable. Trevor was looking at an older version of himself. Or rather, he was seeing for the first time what he would look like in 25 years. "Are you all right, dear? You've gone quite pale," Mrs. Patterson said, concern creasing her weathered face. "I'm fine," Trevor managed, though his voice sounded far away even to his own ears. Can I borrow this?" That evening, Trevor hid the magazine under his mattress and read the article by flashlight, long after Caroline had said goodnight. Nathan Prescott had inherited Prescott Industries from his father, Wallace Prescott, a domineering figure who had built the company from nothing and expected his son to maintain the family legacy. Nathan had attended Harvard Business School, married young to someone named Victoria Hartwell, daughter of another prominent Portland family, and was considered one of the city's most eligible bachelors before his marriage. The article mentioned his commitment to philanthropy and dedication to family values, phrases that rang hollow now that Trevor understood the truth. But it was the photograph that Trevor kept returning to, studying every detail of Nathan Prescott's face. There was something in the man's eyes, even in the professionally composed portrait, that suggested a deep unhappiness, carefully concealed beneath the veneer of success. Or perhaps Trevor was simply projecting his own desperate need to believe that his father's absence caused him pain, that somewhere in that expensive suit and that sleek car was a man who wished things could be different. The second revelation came 3 days before the next third Tuesday, when Trevor accidentally knocked over his mother's purse while reaching for the cereal box. Among the scattered contents, wallet, keys, lipstick, receipts, a photograph fluttered to the floor, creased and faded from being carried for years. It showed a much younger Carolyn, barely out of her teens. Laughing with her arms around a young man Trevor immediately recognized as a younger Nathan Prescott. They were standing in front of a fountain somewhere, and the way they looked at each other spoke of a love so intense it seemed to radiate from the photograph itself. "Trevor!" Caroline's sharp voice startled him. She rushed forward, snatching the photograph with a speed that betrayed its importance. "You shouldn't go through my things." "I didn't mean to, Mom. I just knocked over your purse." Trevor watched as she carefully tucked the photo back into her wallet, her hands shaking slightly. "Mom, who is that man with you?" Caroline's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, pain, resignation, and finally a weary kind of acceptance. She sank into the chair across from him, suddenly looking every one of her 32 years and more. "That was a long time ago, sweetheart. Before you were born." "Is he my father?" The question escaped before Trevor could stop it, direct and unfiltered. The silence that followed felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only seconds. Caroline's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "Yes, his name is Nathan. Nathan Prescott. Why doesn't he live with us? Why does he only come once a month?" The questions Trevor had been storing for weeks came pouring out. Why does he sit in his car instead of coming upstairs? Why don't I have his last name? Why? Because his father wouldn't allow it. Caroline's voice was flat, defeated. Nathan's father had plans for him, plans that didn't include a waitress from the wrong side of town and an unplanned pregnancy. When I told Nathan I was expecting you, he wanted to marry me. He wanted to leave everything and start over somewhere else. But Wallace Prescott threatened to destroy him, to cut him off completely, to make sure he never worked anywhere in the industry again. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture Trevor had seen countless times, but now understood in a completely different context. Nathan was 25, fresh out of business school, with nothing of his own. His father controlled everything, his job, his trust fund, his future. And Wallace made it very clear that if Nathan chose us, we would all pay the price. He would use every resource at his disposal to make our lives miserable, to ensure that Nathan never succeeded at anything, and by extension, that you and I would suffer too. So he chose his father over us? Trevor felt anger rising in his chest, hot and righteous. No, baby. He chose to protect us the only way he could. Caroline reached across the table to take Trevor's hand. Nathan made a deal with his father. He would do everything Wallace demanded. Marry the woman Wallace chose for him, take over the company, live the life Wallace had planned. But in return, Wallace would leave us alone, and Nathan would be allowed to help us financially. The money he brings every month, it's not just rent, Trevor, it's everything. Medical bills, groceries, your school supplies, the repairs on our car. Nathan takes care of us the only way his father will permit. Trevor's mind reeled with this new information. The man in the expensive car wasn't a coward or a deadbeat father. He was trapped, just as surely as they were, in a cage built by Wallace Prescott's money and power and expectations. And for 7 years, Nathan had been living a double life. The dutiful son and CEO by day, the secret father and provider by night, allowed only these brief monthly encounters to see the child he'd been forced to abandon. Does he want to know me? Trevor asked, his voice small and uncertain. Caroline's expression crumbled. Oh, sweetheart. He asks about you constantly. What you're learning in school, what books you're reading, whether you're happy. He knows everything about you, your favorite color, your best friend's name, how you like your sandwiches cut diagonally. He can't be here. Not the way he wants to be. Trevor looked down at his hands, trying to process everything he'd just learned. The next third Tuesday was only 3 days away, and now his plan to confront the man in the car had taken on an entirely new significance. Nathan Prescott wasn't just a stranger who might be his father. He was a man who had sacrificed everything he wanted for a life he'd been forced to accept. A man who loved Trevor from a distance, because that was the only way Wallace Prescott would allow him to love at all. But Trevor was 7 years old, and he was tired of being protected by secrets and silences. He was tired of watching his mother work herself to exhaustion while his father sat in a car 3 floors below. And most of all, he was tired of being a secret, something to be hidden and managed and discussed in whispers. In 3 days, Trevor decided, things were going to change. He didn't know how yet, but he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't live like this anymore. And somehow, he suspected his father felt the same way. The third Tuesday of March arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the kind of false spring that made Portlanders shed their rain jackets prematurely, only to regret it when the clouds inevitably returned. Trevor wore his best shirt, a blue button-down Caroline had bought him for school picture day, and spent an unusual amount of time combing his hair in the bathroom mirror. His mother noticed but said nothing, her own anxiety about the evening's ritual manifesting in the way she kept checking the clock and rearranging the already organized kitchen counter. At 6:15, 15 minutes before Nathan Prescott's usual arrival time, Trevor made his move. "Mom, I'm going to play outside for a bit before dinner," he announced, heading toward the door with studied casualness. "It's almost dinner time, honey. Maybe wait until—" Caroline began, but Trevor was already out the door, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell as he descended faster than he ever had before. He reached the building's entrance just as the black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Trevor's heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed through the door and walked directly toward the car, his small sneakers slapping against the wet pavement with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Through the windshield, he could see Nathan Prescott's eyes widen in shock, his hand freezing halfway to the door handle. For a moment, they simply stared at each other through the glass. A 7-year-old boy and a 34-year-old CEO, separated by a car window but connected by blood and circumstance, and 7 years of enforced separation. Then Trevor raised his hand and knocked on the driver's side window. Nathan hesitated, glancing up toward the building's third floor where Caroline would surely be watching in horror before slowly lowering the window. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. They had the same eyes, the same slightly crooked smile, even the same way of tilting their heads when uncertain. "Hello?" Nathan said softly, his voice carrying that same depth Trevor had heard from the stairwell a month ago. "You're Trevor." "I know who you are," Trevor replied, his rehearsed speech evaporating in the face of actually confronting his father. "You're Nathan Prescott. You run Prescott Industries. You're married to someone named Victoria." He paused, gathering his courage. "And you're my dad." Nathan's face went through a series of expressions: shock, pain, fear, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "Your mother told you. I figured it out first, then she confirmed it." Trevor straightened his shoulders, trying to appear older than his 7 years. "Why don't you ever come upstairs? Why do you just sit in your car? It's complicated, Trevor." Nathan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "There are rules I have to follow, agreements that were made before you were born. Agreements with your father, because he didn't want you to have a family with my mom." Trevor had spent the last 3 days processing everything Caroline had told him, and while he didn't understand all the nuances of adult relationships and business empires, he grasped the essential truth. His grandfather's cruelty had shaped his entire existence. Nathan looked genuinely stunned. "How much did your mother tell you?" "Everything, I think." Trevor took a step closer to the car. "She showed me a picture of you two together. She said you wanted to marry her and be with us, but your father wouldn't let you. She said you made a deal to protect us." That's essentially correct." Nathan's voice cracked slightly. "Trevor, I want you to understand something. Not being in your life, not being able to watch you grow up, to teach you things, to be your father in the way you deserve. It's the greatest regret of my life. But my father is a very powerful man, and he made it clear that if I defied him, he would make sure all 3 of us suffered for it, not just financially, but in every way he could manage. He has connections everywhere, in business, in law, in government. I was 25 years old with no resources of my own, and I believed him when he said he could destroy us all. But you're the CEO now," Trevor pointed out, with the logical clarity of childhood. "You run the company. Can't you make your own decisions?" Nathan laughed, a bitter sound without any real humor. "I run the company, but my father still controls the majority shares. He's chairman of the board. Every major decision I make has to go through him, and he reminds me regularly of our agreement. I can help support you and your mother financially, but I can never publicly acknowledge you as my son. I can never leave Victoria, never disrupt the image of the perfect Prescott family heir. If I break those rules, the money stops, and worse things follow." Trevor absorbed this information, his young mind working through the implications. "So you're trapped, just like we are." "Yes." The single word carried the weight of 7 years of captivity in a gilded cage. "But Trevor, please believe me when I say that I think about you every single day. I know everything about you. Your teacher's name is Mrs. Henderson. Your best friend is Marcus. You're reading at a 5th grade level even though you're only in 2nd grade. You want a dog, but your apartment doesn't allow pets. I know all of this because your mother tells me, and those monthly conversations are what I live for." "That's not enough," Trevor said simply. "Knowing about me isn't the same as knowing me." The truth of this statement hung in the air between them, undeniable and devastating. Nathan's eyes filled with tears, something Trevor suspected didn't happen often to CEOs of major corporations. "You're right. It's not enough. It's never been enough. But I don't know how to change it without risking everything. Mom says you ask about me all the time," Trevor continued, emboldened by his father's honesty. "What do you want to know?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Everything. I want to know what makes you laugh, what you're afraid of, what you dream about at night. I want to know if you like baseball or basketball, whether you prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream, what subject you like best in school. I want to know every single thing about you, Trevor, because you're my son, and I've missed 7 years of your life." "I like basketball better than baseball because it's faster," Trevor said, ticking items off on his fingers. Chocolate ice cream, always chocolate. I'm afraid of the dark sometimes, but I don't tell Mom because she worries. I dream about having a big house with a yard where I could have a dog. And my favorite subject is reading, because stories can take you anywhere, even if you're stuck in one place. Nathan smiled through his tears, a genuine expression of joy mixed with profound sadness. You're exactly like your mother. She always loved reading too. Used to carry a book everywhere she went. She still does, Trevor said. Library books mostly. We can't afford to buy many. The reminder of their financial situation, so different from Nathan's own, seemed to pain him physically. I wish I could do more. I wish I could... He stopped, shaking his head. I wish a lot of things. Trevor made a decision then, one that would change the trajectory of all their lives. I want to meet your father. What? No, Trevor, absolutely not. Nathan's response was immediate and emphatic. My father is not a kind man. He's manipulative, controlling, and he wouldn't hesitate to hurt you to maintain his control over me. But he doesn't know about me, right? Not really. He knows I exist, but he's never met me. Trevor's mind was working quickly now, putting together a plan that was probably foolish but felt necessary. What if I went to your office, just showed up one day? What could he do if I was already there? Trevor, you don't understand what you're suggesting. My father would... Nathan began, but he was interrupted by the sound of footsteps running down the building's front steps. Caroline appeared, breathless and panicked, her hair disheveled from running. Trevor Mitchell, get away from that car right now. Mom, wait, Trevor started, but Caroline was already pulling him back from the vehicle, her eyes flashing with a protective fury Nathan clearly recognized. What were you thinking? She demanded, turning on Nathan. 7 years, Nathan. 7 years you followed the rules, kept your distance, protected him from your father's world, and now... Caroline, he approached me. I didn't... Nathan climbed out of the car, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. Standing at his full height, he was tall and commanding, every inch the successful CEO, except for the expression of utter helplessness on his face. He knows everything. He figured it out. I wanted to meet him, Mom, Trevor interjected, stepping between his parents. I wanted to talk to my dad. The word, Dad, seemed to stop all three of them in their tracks. It was the first time Trevor had said it out loud, and the power of that simple syllable in this context was immense. Caroline's anger dissolved into tears, and Nathan looked like he'd been punched in the chest. Trevor, Nathan began, but couldn't seem to find the words to continue. I have an idea, Trevor said, looking between his parents with the kind of determination that suggested he'd inherited stubbornness from both sides of his family. What if we stopped hiding? What if I went to Prescott Industries and told everyone who I am? Your father can't make me disappear if people know about me. And maybe if enough people know the truth, he can't control you anymore. Trevor, that's incredibly dangerous, Caroline said. But there was something in her voice, a note of possibility, perhaps even hope, that suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. It could work, Nathan said slowly, his business mind clearly turning over the angles. If the truth came out publicly, if there was media attention, my father couldn't simply make you vanish without massive repercussions. It would destroy the family image he's worked so hard to build. He might actually have to accept... He stopped, looking at Caroline. But it would be messy, ugly. The press would be brutal, especially to you and Trevor. My marriage would end, which honestly wouldn't bother me at all. But Victoria's family would make things difficult. And my father, he would fight back with everything he has. I'm tired of hiding, Caroline said quietly. I'm tired of pretending Trevor doesn't have a father. I'm tired of taking your money like some kind of dirty secret. Maybe Trevor's right. Maybe it's time to stop letting Wallace Prescott dictate our lives. The three of them stood there on the sidewalk, an unlikely family unit brought together by chance and separated by circumstance, contemplating a decision that could either free them all or destroy what little stability they'd managed to build. Above them, lights were coming on in the apartment building as other residents returned home from work. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the extraordinary moment unfolding below. If we do this, Nathan said finally, we do it together, all three of us, and we prepare for the worst, because my father won't go down without a fight. Trevor looked up at his parents, both of them scared, both of them determined, and nodded. When? Nathan checked his watch, a reflex of a man who lived by schedules and appointments. My father always does his board meetings on Friday afternoons. That's in 3 days. If you're serious about this, that's when we should make our move. Maximum visibility, maximum impact. Then Friday it is, Caroline said, taking Trevor's hand in hers and reaching out with her other hand to Nathan. For the first time in 7 years, the three of them stood together, connected physically and symbolically, preparing to face the man who had kept them apart. Whatever happened on Friday, Trevor knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Friday afternoon arrived with deceptive calmness, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to mock the storm about to break inside the gleaming headquarters of Prescott Industries. The building stood in Portland's Pearl District, 20 stories of glass and steel that reflected the city around it like a mirror designed to deflect scrutiny. Trevor stood on the sidewalk holding his mother's hand, staring up at the structure where his father spent his days, and his grandfather wielded power like a weapon. Caroline had called in sick to the diner for the first time in 3 years. She wore her nicest dress, a navy blue number she usually reserved for job interviews, and had styled her hair with more care than Trevor had seen in months. Despite her efforts to appear confident, he could feel her hand trembling in his, could see the way she kept taking deep breaths as if preparing to dive underwater. Nathan met them in the lobby, looking nothing like the composed CEO Trevor had seen in magazine photographs. His tie was slightly crooked, his hair less perfectly styled than usual, and there was a wildness in his eyes that suggested he'd slept very little over the past 3 days. "You came," he said, the relief in his voice evident. "We said we would," Caroline replied, her voice steadier than her hand. "There's still time to turn back," Nathan offered, though Trevor noticed he didn't actually move toward the exit. "Once we step into that elevator, once we walk into that boardroom, there's no undoing what happens next." Trevor squeezed his mother's hand and looked up at his father. "I'm ready." The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt both endless and far too short. Nathan explained the situation in rapid, businesslike terms, as if laying out a battle strategy. "There are 12 board members, including my father. Most of them are his allies, but a few have been growing tired of his authoritarian style. The meeting starts at 2 o'clock. They'll be discussing the quarterly reports, which means my father will be in full command mode. He doesn't like being interrupted during these meetings, which is exactly why we're going to interrupt him." "Won't security stop us?" Caroline asked as the elevator climbed higher. "Not if I'm with you," Nathan replied. "I'm still the CEO, even if my father treats me like a puppet. I have every right to bring guests to observe a board meeting." He smiled grimly, though he's going to be furious that I didn't warn him first. The 20th floor was all polished marble and expensive art, the kind of corporate luxury that was meant to intimidate visitors and remind them of the company's power. A stern-looking secretary started to rise from her desk as they approached, but Nathan waved her off. "It's fine, Margaret. They're with me." Through the glass walls of the boardroom, Trevor could see a long table surrounded by men and women in expensive suits, all facing a man at the head of the table who could only be Wallace Prescott. Even seated, he commanded the space with an authority that seemed to make the air around him heavy. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with features that would have been handsome if not for the coldness that radiated from him like frost. Nathan paused with his hand on the door handle. "Last chance," he said, looking at Caroline and Trevor with an expression that contained equal parts fear and hope. "Open the door, Dad," Trevor said, using the word deliberately, watching as it transformed his father's face from anxious to determined. The boardroom fell silent as Nathan pushed open the door and walked in with Caroline and Trevor flanking him. All 12 board members turned to stare, but it was Wallace Prescott's reaction that held everyone's attention. His eyes moved from his son to the woman and child beside him, and something dangerous flickered across his face before he locked it down behind a mask of corporate politeness. "Nathan," Wallace said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had probably ended careers and crushed competitors. "This is highly irregular. We're in the middle of a quarterly review." "I know, Father," Nathan replied, and Trevor noticed how his voice had changed, becoming harder and more assertive than he'd ever heard it. "But I have something more important than quarterly reports to discuss, something that affects the future of this company and this family." Wallace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whatever it is can wait until after the meeting. Please escort your guests out. No, Nathan said simply, and the single word seemed to echo in the expensive space. I've waited 7 years, Father. I've followed your rules, lived the life you designed, pretended to be the son you wanted me to be, but I'm done waiting. We're all done waiting. He gestured to Trevor, who stepped forward with a courage he didn't entirely feel. Board members of Prescott Industries, I'd like to introduce you to my son, Trevor Mitchell. He's 7 years old, he's brilliant, he loves basketball and reading, and until 3 days ago, I'd never had a real conversation with him because my father forbade it. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Several board members gasped audibly. Others leaned forward with obvious interest. One older woman, Patricia something, Trevor would later learn, smiled with what looked like satisfaction, as if a suspicion had finally been confirmed. But it was Wallace Prescott's reaction that dominated the room. He stood slowly, his face turning red with barely controlled rage. Nathan, step outside with me. Now. It was not a request. No, Father. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of these people. They deserve to know the truth about the family values you're always claiming to represent. Wallace turned his attention to Caroline, his eyes raking over her with open contempt. I paid you to disappear. We had an agreement. No, Caroline said, her voice shaking but clear. You made threats, and I was young and scared and had a baby to protect, but you never paid me a cent. Nathan did. Every month for 7 years, Nathan has supported his son, the son you forced him to abandon. Is this true, Wallace? Patricia Chen, Trevor would later learn was her name, asked sharply. She was perhaps 60, elegantly dressed, with the kind of presence that suggested she was used to being heard. You forced Nathan to abandon his child. I protected this family and this company from a gold-digging opportunist who trapped my son with a pregnancy. Wallace shot back, his composure cracking. Nathan was 25 years old, fresh out of business school, with a brilliant future ahead of him. This woman would have destroyed all of that. This woman, Caroline said, stepping forward with a fury Trevor had never seen in his gentle mother, loved your son. This woman was 19 years old and terrified when she got pregnant. This woman gave Nathan the choice to stay or go, and he chose to stay until you threatened to destroy all of us. Don't you dare rewrite history to make yourself the hero of this story, Mr. Prescott. You're not protecting your family. You're controlling it, and you've been doing it so long you can't tell the difference anymore. The boardroom erupted in murmurs, board members conferring with each other in low voices, while Wallace stood frozen in a rage so profound, it seemed to render him temporarily speechless. Nathan used the moment to address the board directly. For 7 years I've been living a lie, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. I've been married to a woman I don't love, playing the role of dutiful son while my real son grows up 3 floors above a laundromat. I've been running this company according to my father's dictates while watching the woman I've always loved work. Double shifts to make ends meet. I've been pretending that quarterly profits and market share matter more than the child I created and abandoned. He moved to stand beside Trevor, placing a hand on his shoulder, but I'm done pretending. This is Trevor Mitchell, and he's my son. I'm not asking for permission anymore, Father. I'm not asking for your approval or your blessing. I'm telling you, and everyone in this room, the truth. And if that costs me my position in this company, so be it. Some things are more important than profit margins and family legacy. Patricia Chen stood, commanding attention without raising her voice. Wallace, I've served on this board for 15 years. I've watched you bully your son, micromanage every department, and treat this company like your personal fiefdom. But forcing Nathan to abandon his child crosses a line even you shouldn't have crossed. Patricia, you don't understand the full situation, Wallace began, but she cut him off with a gesture. I understand perfectly, and I suspect I'm not the only one. She looked around the table, where several other board members were nodding. Wallace, you may control the majority shares, but we still have voices on this board. And I, for one, am tired of watching you destroy lives in the name of protecting the Prescott name. What followed was the most intense hour of Trevor's young life. Board members argued, Wallace threatened. Nathan presented documents he'd been secretly preparing for years, showing how his father had used company resources to maintain surveillance on Caroline and Trevor, ensuring they stayed invisible and compliant. Patricia Chen revealed that she'd been suspicious of Wallace's control over Nathan for years, and had been waiting for the right moment to challenge his authority. The turning point came when Nathan produced one final piece of evidence, a recording from 7 years ago, when Wallace had explicitly threatened to destroy Caroline and make sure she never worked in this city again, if Nathan didn't comply with his demands. The illegality of such threats, combined with Wallace's use of company resources for personal vendettas, gave the board the ammunition they needed. By 4 o'clock, Wallace Prescott had been removed as chairman of the board, pending a full investigation into his conduct. Nathan was confirmed as CEO with actual authority, not just a title, and Trevor Mitchell was publicly acknowledged as Nathan Prescott's son, with all the legal and familial rights that entailed. The aftermath unfolded over the following months like a dream Trevor kept expecting to wake from. Nathan filed for divorce from Victoria, who turned out to be more relieved than angry, having suspected for years that her husband's heart belonged to someone else. The divorce was quiet and expensive, but not nearly as messy as everyone had feared. Victoria remarried within a year to someone she'd apparently been seeing for quite some time, suggesting that Nathan wasn't the only one who'd been living a lie. Wallace Prescott, facing multiple legal issues and the loss of his iron grip on the company, retreated to his estate and was rarely seen in public afterward. Some family relationships, Trevor learned, couldn't be repaired, and Nathan seemed at peace with the permanent estrangement from his father. But it was the smaller changes that meant the most to Trevor. The way Nathan started appearing at his school for parent-teacher conferences, sitting beside Caroline with his hand in hers. The way they moved into a real house 6 months later, complete with a yard and a golden retriever puppy Nathan brought home as a surprise. The way his father taught him to shoot baskets in their new driveway, both of them laughing when Trevor finally made a shot from the free throw line. The way, one evening a year after that Friday boardroom confrontation, Nathan proposed to Caroline in that same living room, where they now gathered for dinner every night. It was simple and perfect, just the three of them. Nathan on one knee with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, the one member of his father's family who had defied Wallace by leaving Nathan her inheritance independently. "I should have done this 8 years ago," Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have had the courage then that our son showed me now. But if you'll have me, Caroline, if you'll let me spend the rest of my life making up for the years I lost, I promise I'll never let anyone come between us again." Caroline said yes through happy tears, and Trevor found himself sandwiched between his parents in a group hug that felt like coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar territory. 2 years after that Friday in the boardroom, Trevor Mitchell, who had legally become Trevor Mitchell Prescott, sat in the backyard of their house watching his parents dance to music drifting from the kitchen. They'd been married for 18 months, but they still looked at each other like newlyweds, making up for lost time with a devotion that sometimes embarrassed Trevor, but mostly made him feel safe in a way he'd never experienced in that third-floor apartment. His grandfather Wallace had passed away 6 months earlier, estranged from Nathan, but leaving Trevor a substantial trust fund in his will. Perhaps, Nathan suggested, his father's only act of genuine remorse. Trevor had mixed feelings about the inheritance, but his parents had helped him establish a foundation to help single mothers in situations similar to what Caroline had faced, turning something complicated into something good. Life wasn't perfect. Nathan still worked long hours sometimes, and Caroline still had moments where years of struggle caught up with her. But they were together, openly and honestly, a real family, rather than a secret kept in the shadows of a monthly car visit. As Trevor headed inside for dinner, his dog bounding ahead of him, he thought about that 7-year-old boy who'd knocked on a car window and asked his father why he never came upstairs. That boy had been brave enough to demand the truth, and brave enough to face the consequences of revealing it. He'd understood something that the adults in his life had forgotten. Some secrets are more destructive than the truth could ever be, and sometimes it takes a child's clarity to see the path forward, when everyone else is too scared to move. "Trevor, dinner," his mother called, and his father's deeper voice echoed her invitation. Trevor smiled and ran toward the house, toward his family, toward the life they'd all been too afraid to fight for, until a 7-year-old boy decided he'd had enough of hiding. Sometimes, he'd learned, the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to live in the shadows anymore. And sometimes, Courage is contagious.